Honourable Chair, distinguished delegates, while we appreciate very much the substantive debate right now, we believe that actually this is about integrating, this is about the framework, meaning do we want to have specific goals and targets for developed countries as well as for developing, or is it rather a general thing? Because I think the substantive debate should come tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.
Taiwan.
Dear Delegate, I would like to echo one of the points raised by Ekbit, that still developed and developing is a very is a changing idea. And then I would like to draw your attention to maybe look more on a South-South partnership, and then develop our targets based on each country's human development index, because developing and developed is basically a GDP idea. We should look beyond GDP. Thank you.
I just want to point out to you as well that development targets for developed countries doesn't necessarily mean internal targets, but it can mean targets around responsibility to ensure that other countries are being worked with in genuine partnerships, that developed countries are helping to increase resilience, that they're being responsive to the needs and wants in the country, that it's not top-down, as Kenya has already emphasised, and to use a word that we use a lot, which is capacity building. You can set a target for developed countries around capacity building within developing nations in order to achieve the other targets you can set.
Anthony?
I agree with the representative from Red Cross that we need to make these goals sustainable, because you know that in my review paper I wrote it that you need to teach someone how to fish and not how to and not to give him or her a fish. That is the way you can make it sustainable. So in order to make this development sustainable, we have to make sure that we provide the way forward
Japan?
As a coming worker of Japanese International Cooperation Agency, I want to share with you the basic principle of Japanese aid is to promote self-drive. Actually, driving development by yourself, it itself requires for example, you need infrastructure, you need the necessary means of financing. So I think in that sense, with regards to this issue, I think we should talk about the donors, the ODA donors' commitment to this aid for self-drive. I think the distinction between development and being developed in developing countries is difficult, but we can, in one way, define it by saying the OECD country, like a donor, and then we can talk about donor commitments. And I'd like to, okay, never mind, I'm not. Thank you.
Hong Kong. Thank you, Chair.
Our delegates have raised great points about how, about really detailed regarding how we set targets for developed countries and developing countries. So I would like to focus on the generic framework, as mentioned by our delegate from Germany. So I propose that for our global goals, we can have some, as what delegates from the Philippines mentioned, there are goals that apply to both developing and developed countries. Well, of course, the distinction of developing and developed countries we should discuss later on. But there, maybe on a regional level or national level, there will be goals pertaining to developed countries or developing countries. And that relates to what the Red Cross representative talked about as to external targets and internal targets.
Thank you, Delegate. Given the time, we will not recognize another speaker. This moderator focus will expire. Are there any points or motions on the floor? Peru?
Motion for a 15-minute moderation clock with 45 seconds per speaker to discuss whether the framework will be legally binding.
Are there any other points or motions? Australia?
A motion to extend the current moderating focus by 5 minutes, 7 speaking time.
Any other points or motions? Philippines?
Motion to set for a moderated caucus on the discussion of time frame for the framework intermediate targets or 1 second goal for 10 minutes with 45 seconds.
I'll explain the order of voting precedence. We'll vote first
now resume the moderator focus, and that's Charlie and Ministers.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Honourable Delegates, I thank you for the discussion that's currently been undertaken. I'd like to propose a twofold way of addressing this issue in terms of developed countries, also bearing in mind the distinction between developed and developing. So first of all, I think we need to, this is more an overarching thing for all countries, we need to recognise the issues within all countries. That applies to both developed and developing, so that we don't need to worry about the blurring boundaries. We just need to recognise that in developed countries as well, there is a lot of marginalised groups. For example, in Australia, the Aboriginal community is quite marginalised, and that's an issue that does need to be addressed. So the second point in the twofold plan is the commitments of the donor nations to LDCs, but also taking into account aid effectiveness and trying to sort of counteract the aid dependence cycle.
Thank you, Ghana.
I propose that as we develop the goals, we have global goals. So the global goals addresses inequalities. But aside that, we can recognize some of the goals. So for developing countries, we have a focus, and then the developed countries will have a focus as well. But in all, we have an AMDA, which is the global goal that we all seek to achieve. That's addressing inequalities. Now, one of the listeners we focus on is aid, as the Honourable from Australia said. So that aid, for instance, tied aid, could do away with tied aid, right? And then move on with investing aid. So that aid given to developing countries could be invested, as I've been stressing, on the sustainable ventures. And then developing countries to have the focus on.
So, like the delegate of Australia said, the effectiveness of aid is a huge deal. That's a huge part of this discussion that we're having right now. Because really, has there been, I don't know, maybe one of the NGOs can answer this, but is there a direct correlation between the amount of aid towards development and progression that developing countries are receiving? That's something we have to think about. What we also have to think about is who is held accountable for development within the developing nations. Right now, a lot of developing nations feel that the developed states are, the ones progressing more towards their own, the developing nations' individual targets. So that's what we have to decide. Who's held accountable for these targets?
France?
Honourable ladies, as you might know, French people love to complain about their living. I'm very French at that. So I do not settle for the situation in France or in other Western countries. I will never say that the situations are comparable. However, we believe there are common goals to all the countries. For example, nutrition. Some people worry about if they're going to eat in the day. Others suffer from obesity and die for it. There's also water. We're all going to face the scarcity of water in the next few years. Gender inequalities and really all kinds of inequalities. You might not know, but actually slums are us.
Holland?
I think while talking about development aid, of course it is very important that it should be made more effective. However, the most important thing is the private sector. So it doesn't matter if a Western country, let's say the Netherlands, is giving 0 point something development aid, as long as that multinationals go and do business in developing countries, avoiding taxes and not doing sustainable business. That's the biggest problem, and that would also should be addressed in the agenda.
Generally, I want to call your caution to the notion of GDP within that developed and developing countries. So I would propose that other indicators such as GNP, gross national happiness, as well as Human Development Index, into setting targets, because this is one of the aspects looking beyond GDP that has been brought on the table during Breakfast 20.
I just want to talk briefly about amount of aid, because it's not necessarily, obviously we all think the amount of aid needs to be increased, but it's also about efficiency, and it's about how governments, the restrictions governments put on that. So one thing that USAID does, which it makes things really difficult, is that, say you want to distribute condoms, you have to buy them from an American manufacturer, which drastically increases your cost. You can't buy them from an Asian manufacturer, say. So that you have to then make the choice between buying fewer products and being able to help fewer people, or kind of not having that aid. So it's also about the restrictions that developed countries put on their aid that kind of affect the effectiveness.
Thank you, Alex. The moderator caucus is now last. Before I ask for any other points or motions, I'll just draw your attention to the fact that our session today goes until 1:30. It's now 12:15. Bearing this in mind, we will be open to a motion for a 2-minute break should you wish to take one. You'll just need to motion to suspend that debate for a 2-minute break. If anyone would like to do that in the next round of motions, feel free. Any points or motions on the floor? Great.
I would like to open a moderated caucus of 15 minutes, 45 seconds, speakers' times on whether the framework will be legally signed.
Thank you. Are there any other points or motions? Belgium? Motion to suspend for 10 minutes. Any other points or motions? Australia.
Motion for a 15-minute moderated caucus, speaker time of 45 seconds on the time frame.
Okay, so to explain voting and order of voting precedents, we have 2 moderated caucuses of equal time. We'll vote in the order they were introduced. So first, the 15-minute moderated caucus on whether the new framework should be legally binding. Second, whether the 15 minutes on the time frame for the new framework. And then on the motion to suspend debate for a 10-minute break. So those in favour of the first moderated caucus of 15 minutes on whether the new framework should be legally binding, please raise your cards now. Those opposed? Motion fails. Those in favour of the moderated caucus on the time frame for the new framework, please raise your cards. And those opposed? Those in favour of the motion to suspend debate for 10 minutes, please raise your cards. Suspend debate for 10 minutes. We're back again for a minute this time. Thank you. At this point, we've got an hour left in the session, and as I'm sure you're all aware, we've got the last 2 points on our agenda to get through. So I'll encourage you to make motions that move us through those important points and towards developing the work and by the end of the day, developing working on our agenda items for today. And sorry, no, that's okay. All right. So with all of that in mind, do we have any points or motions on the floor? Germany?
We motion for a 15-minute moderated caucus on the topic of whether the framework will be legally binding. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Thank you. Any other points or motions, Australia?
Motion for a moderated caucus of 15 minutes, speaker time 45 seconds on the time frame for the framework.
Any other points or motions? Philippines?
Motion for a 10-minute moderated caucus on 45 seconds speaker time on the time frame for framework.
Yes, we have 2. Sorry.
Under parliamentary environment. Where is it exactly in the Dropbox, the response paper of NGOs?
It might not have come through on the internet. Sorry, it has been put in there, so it's all in the resources during the study.
Supposed to just be 2.
How many are there supposed to be? Sorry.
Oh, okay.
So there should be 3, so the last one might just be.
It's another folder.
Yeah.
in response.
Yeah, it's that one, the position.
Alright, so moving on to voting procedure, we will vote first on the 15-minute moderated caucus with a 30-minute individual speaking time on whether the new framework should be legally binding. If that fails, we'll move on to a 15-minute the vote on the 15-minute moderated caucus on the time frame for the new framework. And if that fails, we'll then move on to a 10-minute moderated caucus on the time frame. So with that in mind, those in favour of the 15-minute moderated caucus on whether the framework should be legally binding, please raise your cards now. Those opposed? That motion fails. We'll now move on to the vote on the second 15-minute moderated caucus on the time frame for the new framework. Those in favour, raise your cards. Sorry, I'll just count again. Putting them up. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and those opposed. That motion passes, so we will now open the 15-minute moderated caucus on the time frame, and we will begin with Australia.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Delegates, as we mentioned a little bit earlier on, and also from our discussions yesterday, we do need to
have a look at what the timeframe is going to be for the next framework, and especially consider, as has been mentioned a number of times, the inclusion of intermediate targets, or whether these are necessary. I think from our discussions in unmoderated caucuses especially, there is a general consensus that we do need intermediate targets for the purpose of data collection, and also just for monitoring progress and making sure that governments and other actors are implementing policies right from the very beginning to achieve these end goals. In terms of the time frame overall, just very quickly, I think we need to have a look back at whether we believe the 15 years or the 25 years from the actual base year has been sufficient, whether it's been too long or too short, and reconsider that for inclusion in our new framework.
Sorry. I particularly believe that it's too soon to be talking about a time frame. We haven't even defined the goals and what we're going to achieve. It's much, it obviously will take us much more time if we want to reduce population by 80% than if we set a goal to reduce population by 20%. So I believe that the first step should be defining the goals, defining what proportion we should want to achieve, and then we will see in how many years or decades it is reasonable to achieve them. Japan?
I agree with the evaluation here. We haven't decided which goals we are going to talk about, so I think it's too soon to talk about specifically when to set the targets. But I think it is also efficient if we can talk about whether or not we are going to set timeframes. And in this regard, I think we should set timeframes because as we can see, the problems we are facing now, the problems that we were facing when the MDGs were decided, is totally changing. Development is always going on, and we can never know that the goals you set today would be relevant in the next year or the year after. So I think we should try to get answers, but not go into specifics. Thank you.
Germany.
Distinguished Chair, esteemed delegates, while I agree partially with what Guru says, I believe that we can do it the other way around as well. So we can now define which time frame we want to have, and then we can see what proportions would be adequate for that. Concerning the intermediate targets, I believe as well that there was rather consensus that it's needed. What the EU is proposing, and I'm not too far off, well, I've shared the opinion. They have the vision for 2050, but they have the, the decent life concept goes until 2030, and then they see what is going on later. But the immediate targets are important as well.
I have similar sentiments made by the delegate of Germany, and I also understand sentiments made by the delegate of Japan. But yes, that we haven't made yet any discussion on terms of measurements or what have you, but I believe that the discussion's more on if we should have a single time frame or an intermediate time frame or a mix of both. And I do believe that there's already consensus with the intermediate targets. It's just more discussion if we should include a final target for all those things. But I think it's more the fact that we're not going to go to specifics. We're not going to say if it's 50 years or not. It's more of if we will have final target in general.
Fellow delegates, I will echo what my neighbor Kimberly said. So we have consensus on the intermediate targets. So for the sake of simplicity, maybe we shouldn't go into too many targets like visual time frame and all that. Bear in mind that we talked about new challenges. What if something completely unexpected happen in the next 10 years or so? So maybe we should do something around 2030, and then we could go on from there. That's what I believe. We do not know the future.
I have two quick points to make. First of all, I don't agree at all with what Jeremy said about the fact that we should put first the time frame and after that the proportion that we have to reach. I do believe that we first should put the goals, what we have to reach, and then how to achieve it, which can be considered as the time frame. And the second one concerns the intermediate targets. I think that we have to balance two things. The first one is that intermediate targets can help to hold the governments accountable for what they do, but on the other hand, it also doesn't help to have a long-scale vision, and sometimes you see progress. If it's only on 5 years, you cannot see the plan that the government has for the 30 years to come.
Thank you, delegates, for your discussion so far. I think in terms of the discussion as to whether the goals precede the time frame or the other way around, I think what we need to consider, if we don't set a specific time frame now before we set the goal, we do need to consider whether it is going to be a shorter time frame or a longer time frame. Because the thing is, if we go in saying, you know, we're going to set the time frame afterwards, we could end up with time frames that are sort of 40, 50 years down the track, and that really isn't going to keep governments or any other actors engaged with the framework. We do need to have, maybe even just with the intermediate targets, we do need to have these points which are more in the near future so that the actors remain engaged and also so that the general public remains engaged as well.
Yes, sir?
Perhaps a good place to start would be to identify what your baseline year is and then progress from there and identifying your period of years and intermediate goal achievements, etc.
The Philippines actually finds the point made that the is very interesting, that maybe it's best we discuss first the baseline, then we discuss if possible we can put a final target there. Then from there we can work on how many years would it take or what have you. Then from there I think it will help a lot in the discussion of how we are able to shape the framework that we're currently making.
I believe we have all heard the experiment of if you try to give a chocolate to a kid and tell them that in 1 hour he will have 5, but if he is sick now he will have 3, he will choose to have 3 right now. That is how psychology works. We want to have targets that are easier to achieve and that are closer to us. And that can be translated into our targets by putting intermediate targets. So every 2 years, every 3 years, we will have some sort of success, some sort of goal that we want to achieve that will motivate people. And regarding the starting point, I believe that the framework that we propose should not be achieved in should not be created in 2015. It should be before, in 2014. So in 2015, we can start measuring.
Just point of parliamentary priority. Would it start maybe to tap 10 seconds before in the speech so we can make conclusion?
Let's switch to speak next. Hong Kong.
The delegate of Peru just mentioned about the importance of intermediate target, and I believe we're all in agreement with that. So I actually want to address or emphasize the point made by the delegate of Australia. What is the time frame with the period of years that we want to focus on? So in MDG, the period of years is 25 years. Do we want to keep that, or do we want to extend that to a longer time frame, like the one proposed by or suggested by the delegate from Germany, like 2050? So I think this is what we should discuss. And personally, I would think that using the framework, the period of years used by the MDGs would be appropriate, as it is what we've been doing, and it facilitates logistics. Yeah.
I'll say.
Just a couple of points. So rather than intermediate targets, one kind of deadline has its advantages. One, because the pace of change in the world today is quite incredible. But two, MDG progress has accelerated with the deadline approaching. It's kind of provided some kind of impetus for the country. So that's a good motivation to keep in mind as well when having a closer fixed deadline.
Ghana.
I was decided with one of the people from Peru when he said that we should also define the quantum of work we want to do, where we want to get to before we set the deadline. But prior to that, you also want to have to get in mind whether you want a very lengthy period, like 10, 15, 20 years. Then looking at the goals you want to achieve and then the sub-targets, and you might be able to fix within that period 5 years for sub-targets and 10 years or 15 years for the whole goals. So let's define what we want to achieve first and then set the time bound.
Tanzania.
I agree the Ghana that will put a time frame, because that one will be like a deadline and it will be like a reviewing process, so that the government will know that after this period of time we have to provide maybe a report or maybe something to show that we have done something up to this point. So doing so, it means that it will be a pushing mechanism for things to be done on time and making the MDGs and SDGs succeed. Thank you.
Firstly, I want to echo Red Cross's emphasis upon the advantages of having a definite one-off deadline, and also respect to what Peru said. If you are going to go down the path of intermediate targets, 2 to 3 years might be too frequent. You've got to have consideration as to how practical that is and how onerous the statistical data gathering and report preparation will be for states or whoever you want to prepare those reports.
Actually, it seems that UNICEF and I share a mind. So about intermediate targets, 2 or 3 years might be a bit short because remember we're also dealing with the bureaucracies here. There's such thing as incrementalism, meaning that you can change things little by little. And another point on that would be, would you prefer a quick fix or actually a long-term policy that means that in 15, 20 years you would have a sustainable changes? Thank you very much.
German?
Honourable Chair, distinguished delegates, just to come very quickly back to what Belgium disagreed with me. Well, basically, I believe without having one time idea, we cannot fix any goals. So if we have one time framework for all of the goals, then we know where we want to go. But if we establish the goals first, we have to then establish, well, is this going to be feasible in 10 years, this in 15, the next goal in 20 years? So there we have to evaluate a bit. Secondly, I forgot the second point, but we
I would like to agree about the advantages of having a ultimate deadline for a framework, but I would also like to emphasize the importance of intermediate targets because providing my country as an example, the Philippines just only concentrated more on the MDGs when the deadline was near. And that's bad because once we pass the post-2015 development framework, we want to start right now. So I think adding also intermediate targets would also help encourage countries to actually try to achieve the goals. But yeah, I do agree that these intermediate targets shouldn't be too frequent because that will be very impractical and that will be more problematic in terms of bureaucracy and other relevant factors involved.
Japan?
I'm going to say ultimate goals and also intermediate goals, but that being said, I would have to point to the risk of financial crisis. The governance of financial crisis could take as long as 3 to 4 years. So if you consider those kinds of risks, I think 5 years, at least around more than 4 or 5 years is necessary if we are to get intermediate goal, so that it doesn't become unrealistic. Thank you.
Alright. Okay, so now I would like to put the example of university classes. You have a final exam, but you have many little exams in the meantime. You want to pass the course, of course, but if you, for example, fail the first little exam, then you will put more effort towards achieving the second exam, because you already felt bad because you couldn't achieve the first one. Maybe 2 or 3 years, of course, is too little. I just put it as a quick example. Maybe 5, maybe 6 years. But I do believe that having small targets and intermediate targets will be a way to motivate even more towards the final target or the final exam. Almond?
I believe that human development is a little bit more complex than that. But I still believe that we need intermediate targets. So we need one final deadline which will definitely allow more sustainable and continuous growth. And then we have to break that down to intermediate targets. And they will make it also easier to monitor and evaluate. Thank you.
Gotcha.
Maybe to not function and to address the whole audience, I would find that we set deadline first. I think that if we first set our ambitious ambition. The fact that we halve poverty, that we reduce or eradicate poverty, or whatever else, if we set higher aspirational base that we are going to strive for. And I think it will give more impetus to the effort towards the MDGs. The second point is about the baseline that UNICEF raised as a problem. I think that's an issue this is going to be the data collection. We have to ensure that data collection are okay to really put the baseline as a relevance. Thank you.
The Democratic focus has now expired. Are there any points or actions on the floor? Japan?
I would like to extend this Morelli caucus for 4 minutes.
5 minutes? Are there any other points or motions?
Motion to discuss whether the framework will be legally binding for 15 minutes and 40 minutes for speaking.
Are there any other points or motions on the floor? Vote first on the moderated caucus for 15 minutes with all 5 seconds speakers on whether the framework should be legally binding. We will then move to a vote to extend the current moderated caucus by 5 minutes. So those in favour of the 15-minute moderated caucus on the legally binding nature of the framework? And those opposed? That motion passes. We'll now move into the moderated caucus on the topic of whether the new framework should be legally binding.
Thank you, Chair.
Given on foundations,
More legally binding.
and universally accepted documents such as the Declaration of Human Rights and the Kyoto Protocol. All those documents will give much more strength to the document we will create and will therefore help on the enforcement of these documents in every nation. Friends?
Thank you. Fellow delegates, we discussed, if I remember correctly, we discussed values. And values that might not be shared by everybody and every country. So if we make this framework not legally binding, then that might encourage people to vote for it even if they don't exactly agree with it. Another point, it was discussed that we could integrate treaties. For example, in the introduction we talked about the Kyoto Protocol, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, but not everyone ratified them. So if it's not legally binding, they would probably vote for it as well.
Hong Kong?
Thank you, Chair. I have to disagree with the delegate from France. I don't think the MDGs of the post-2015 framework should be legally binding. As what, you said what? Legally binding.
Delegates,
Oh, okay, I was right. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So I agree as well that it should not be legally binding. Not just because of the reasons of implementation, but also in the drafting process. If we spend a lot of time, if it is made legally binding, we'll spend a lot of time in the wordings of the development goals and how it applies, and that will incur a lot of cost. So it's not practical to make it legally binding.
Thank you. United States of America.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with all the delegates that just spoke before me, in that the declaration that we create cannot be legally binding. But what we can do is encourage national governments to, add some more goals to the legislation and create maybe smaller laws in the nations that can be legally binding and will pertain to our declaration. Thank you.
Taiwan?
Thank you, Chair. Dear Sally, we have to look on the reason why we want it to be, why we're considering it to be legally binding. The purpose of one document being legally binding is to supervise the government to a top-down approach to make sure that everyone reaches the targets. So how, if it's not going to be legally binding, how are we going to make sure that everyone's sticking to what we promised to reach? And then a review report, and then some mechanism to ensure implementation at the national level would be relevant.
Kenya?
When we look at aspects of what we come up with, for example, if you look at something like climate change, that applies to every nation, and
without having to involve the international community, but as a nation, for example, in some countries in Africa, the MDGs have been incorporated. Some of them have been incorporated in their constitution, and that means they become like individual rights of individuals. So I'm speaking on a national level and also on international.
To answer the question of Taiwan, how can we make it implementing by the government? Well, I do believe that public pressure, the pressure from the civil society, the academy, the youth, everybody will be a good way to hold the government accountable for what they do. And this will pass through information, because if we know what the government has morally committed to do, then we can make them accountable for what they do. So rather than legally binding, we should go for morally binding. And this will go also with the fact to emphasize on already existing treaties, because there will be two things that they have to accomplish.
If you make the document legally binding and subject to enforcement, I think you need to an extent make it punitive in nature. And I think that compromises a very fundamental benefit of the present framework not being legally binding. In that it's aspirational, it's ambitious, and it unites all the states around the world into achieving a common outcome together. So I think that aspect of working together is something that you need to embrace fully and employ, as opposed to making legally binding and to an extent punitive in that nature.
Following on from that, if we're thinking about trying to make the targets quite aspirational, as soon as you make it legally binding, you're not going to downgrade any type of commitment any country would sign on to. So it's not
Douglas, before we resume, I just need to pause the caucus for a moment for an announcement from Ken. I'm sorry, we can just pause for now.
Thank you. So I just have a few announcements. One is that, just to make sure that everything's going good, if you guys are planning to go to social events, please make sure to bring your passports if you're not Australian, because they've been a little bit more strict about going to social events without passports. Two, if you are performing in cabaret, please make sure to go to the social events booth later to confirm a rehearsal time for your group, because they have set out rehearsal times for you guys, and please make sure to do that. One other thing, Friday at 1 p.m. after all the committee sessions have ended, we're going to be having a barbecue sponsored by Study Melbourne, and they will, you guys can collect tickets for that at the Study Melbourne booth down the ground floor after committee sessions ends today. So at WorldMUN, one other thing that we want to do is to make sure that you guys are having the best delegate experience possible. So in order to do that, we'd like to hear a bit more about feedback that you guys have personally. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to ask the staff and the volunteers to step outside of the committee room for about a few minutes so that I can collect some feedback from you guys really quickly. Yeah. So you guys could step outside. Sorry about that.